Good evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture. I'm Patrick Lewis, Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors from the University of Louisville, the Department of History, the Commonwealth Center for the Humanities and Society, the Women's Center, the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and Phi Alpha Theta. I will moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. Thank you again for joining us for tonight's lecture, Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote. To introduce our speaker tonight, I'll hand off the program to Dr. Christine Herrick of the University of Louisville.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. It gives me such pleasure to introduce our featured speaker for today. Ellen DuBois and I go back just a couple of years, back to when I was a graduate student at UCLA, and she was one of my major professors. I was a Latin Americanist, still am, but at that time, like I said, a few years ago, there weren't really too many people in the history department at UCLA who did a lot of work on women's history, which was something that I was interested in. So along with a number of other Latin Americanists, we all sort of washed ashore, to so to speak, at Ellen's office door, and she was generous enough to take us in and sort of guide us through what was then a new and emerging field. Things have changed since then. The field of women's and gender history has expanded and become less marginal than it was back then. And Ellen is now a professor emeritus of history at UCLA. But even though she is officially retired, she has continued to be very active in publishing in the field. Most important, of course, is the book she will be talking about with us today, Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote, which was published in 2020 by Simon & Schuster in honor of the centennial of the 19th Amendment and a definitive history of the long campaign for women's voting rights in the United States. COVID, of course, really disrupted plans for a book tour for this book, including a planned visit to Louisville, which was supposed to have been about a year ago. So we are happy to have her here virtually, and look forward to having her back here in person at some point in the future. In addition to that, the book she's going to talk about with us today, Ellen has a new edition forthcoming of Through Women's Eyes, An American History with Documents. This new edition will be co-edited with Brenda Stevenson, another one of my heroines from UCLA, so I'm as excited about that collaboration. And Ellen is also working on a biography of US feminist Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But you did not come here to listen to me, so I am going to once again thank you all for being here and help me welcome Ellen DuBois. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I'm really sorry I can't be there in person in Louisville. For a variety of reasons, I was eager to be there, but one of them is that the great historian Eleanor Flexner, whose shoulders I stand on, the great historian of suffrage, was from a distinguished Louisville family and was born in Louisville, and the Flexner family is one of the distinguished families of Louisville. So I speak in honor of the memory of Eleanor Flexner, and now I'm going to go to my screen sharing, and I'm going to begin. So I had the challenge here of covering a lot of American history, 75 years, a quarter, or maybe it's now a fifth of American history in 300 pages. 3 different generations of women who fought for and finally secured, at least in part, the right to vote, and who had let's see, backspace, who had incredible obstacles to face and fortitude in facing them. So I've organized this lecture around what I call 4 surprises about women's suffrage. And I hope this will be interesting both to those of you who know nothing about the subject and to those of you who know a little bit about the subject. So let us start. The first suffrage surprise, which is situated in the years after the Civil War and through the end of the post-Civil War period called Reconstruction, about which we're learning a lot again, I call the Women's Suffrage Constitutional Amendment That Never Was. And this part of the lecture, I think, is not only an important addition to the history of women's suffrage, but also has major implications for the history of American democracy, and especially questions about the right to vote with which we continue to grapple. So let us begin. The story begins in the years right before the 1872 presidential election, a really important presidential election, in which hundreds of women all over the country insisted that they had the right to vote and attempted to cast their ballots in the ballot box, as this woman, the famous suffragist Victoria Woodhull, was doing in New York City. The most famous of these women who were determined to cast their right to vote in the 1872 election for representatives and for the president was Susan B. Anthony. Now, this cartoon captures a lot about her. It is not particularly flattering. She's shown as wearing she's shown as sort of dressing as both a man and a woman, certainly as Uncle Sam, and then as a woman, she's sort of sour looking, not very attractive. But on the election of 1872, November 5th, Susan B. Anthony and several of her female friends and relatives went to their local polling place in her hometown of Rochester and brought their ballots to vote. And they expected to be turned down, and they weren't turned down, because the election polling officer who was in charge that day was a Republican. We're talking about a very different Republican Party here, who learned very quickly that Susan B. Anthony was going to cast her vote for Ulysses S. Grant, his candidate, and so he allowed her to do that. And she was thrilled. She went home, but before I say that, let me say a few words about the grounds on which she and all these other women voted. She spoke to the election polling officer, and she said, "I'm allowed to vote because of the 14th Amendment, which was ratified, the second of the three Reconstruction amendments that was ratified in July of 1868. And she surprised everyone by being allowed to vote. This was her argument. She used the 14th Amendment. She quoted the first part of the 14th Amendment, which is one of the most important parts of the United States Constitution, after perhaps the Bill of Rights. It reads, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are subject to the jurisdiction thereof and are citizens of the United States. This was the first time that there had ever been a definition of American citizenship. Let's see, back. In the Constitution. And then it goes on to say that no state can interfere with the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States or deprive citizens of the United States without due process of the law or equal protection of the laws. So Anthony and all the other women that tried to vote that year argued that it was clear that of the privileges and immunities of national citizenship, it was clear that that the right to vote was one such privilege and immunity. Who could but disagree with that? What it mean to be a citizen of the United States and not be able to vote? 2 weeks after she happily voted, a U.S. Marshal came to her door and told her she was under arrest for the crime of criminal voting. She was tried in a highly controversial case in which the judge, who was actually a sitting member of the United States Supreme Court, refused to allow the jury to come to a decision and told them that they must find her guilty because there were only two issues. Was she a woman and had she voted? And the fact that she believed she had the right to vote and had not intentionally voted in a criminal fashion was not allowed to be administered. She had wanted desperately to appeal her case to the United States Supreme Court and was not allowed to do so. But Scott, the next one, please. No, you can skip to the next one. It was a woman named Virginia Minor who had attempted to vote in St. Louis, Missouri, and sort of right near you. And she brought her case to the Supreme Court. And in 1875, in a very famous case called Minor versus Happersett, Happersett was the name of the polling officer who refused to allow her to vote, the court declared that she was right that the 14th Amendment made her a citizen of the United States under equal protection of the laws, but she was wrong in that the right to vote was not a right of citizenship. This is a picture of the Supreme Court in those years, and you'll see something pretty obvious about it. It was all old, white, somewhat overweight men. Okay, but the suffragists were not done with their work. Next slide. Next one. Yes. 3 years later, Susan B. Anthony, who's seen here on the very edge of the left of the picture, her partner, Elizabeth Stanton, came before the Judiciary Committee of the United States Senate with a proposal for a constitutional amendment, inasmuch as the Supreme Court had said their interpretation of the 14th Amendment would not hold. So she proposed a different amendment. Can you come to the next one, Scott? And this is what I call the constitutional amendment that never was. The right of suffrage in the United States shall be based on citizenship. I'm going to repeat this. This is not the case even to this day. The right of suffrage is not based on national citizenship. I'll come back in a minute. And shall be regulated by Congress. And all citizens of the United States, whether native or naturalized, shall enjoy this right equally, and then without any distinction whatsoever founded on sex. Now, you can probably anticipate that if this were an amendment to the Constitution, which it is not, we would be in a much more secure situation when it came to the right of all citizens to vote. Instead, the Congress was unwilling to advance another constitutional amendment. They finished with the 15th Amendment, and it was another 40 years before they intended, whether they entertained another amendment, and another 50 years before they entertained a women's suffrage amendment. Now let us compare to the next one, please. This is the amendment that was put forward a few years later and became the 19th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States shall not be denied or abridged by the United States, by any state, on account of sex. So I've written it this way so you can see that it's basically the 15th Amendment, which prohibited disfranchisement by states on the grounds of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and replaced that with sex. And then there's a phrase, Congress, it's what's called the execution, the sentence that allowed for execution. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. This was first introduced in 1880, and as we all know, this is the wording that was finally made its way into the Constitution 40 years later in 1920. So just the next one, please, Scott. I just want to compare the amendment that never was and the amendment that was. The amendment that never was written in the affirmative. Citizens have the right to vote, and it was attached to national citizenship. The amendment that finally was put in the negative, and it was attached to states. States can't deny the right to vote on account of sex. As the Supreme Court allowed, the 15th Amendment, which had the same framework, had opened up all kinds of doors to what became the disfranchisement of Black men in the subsequent decades by allowing all kinds of surrogates for race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which allowed the states, the southern states, to disfranchise Black men. Okay, one more, another image, please. One more consequence of the amendment that never was being replaced by the amendment that was had to do with race. This is an image taken from about 1910, focusing on the ways that Black women were kept away from voting by the constitutional amendment based on what became the 19th Amendment. Once it gave up what I called earlier the universal suffrage approach to women's suffrage, the women's suffrage movement abandoned its historical links to the rights of Black people, the political and civil rights of Black people, and became an increasingly white-dominated movement, which was not very hospitable. I'll answer your question, Julie, later. Was not at all hospitable to Black women. Because the 19th Amendment, what became the 19th Amendment, was written in such a limited way, if Black women were prohibited from voting, not because of their sex, but because of their race, the 19th Amendment could do nothing for it. And I'll deal with that in the question and answers. I just show you the next image, I think. Just to show you that these pictures of various African-American women suffragists involved in the women's rights movement from the 1850s on, to show you that even in the decades towards the end of the 19th century, in which Black women were not welcomed into the white-dominated suffrage movement, they continued to fight for and work for the rights to vote from their own African-American organizations. And we'll come back to this in a minute. Next. Okay, here's suffrage surprise number 2. With the ratification of the 15th Amendment, as Elizabeth Stanton put it, the constitutional door was slammed shut and remained so for over another 3 decades, almost 4 decades. In the late 19th century, the suffrage movement focused on one was it did what we would call in the modern years growing the base. It worked to include a broader group of women, much less radical and already politicized than Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It worked to include them in the right to vote. And it was successful in doing that, beginning to lay the basis of a much more mass-based suffrage movement by the end of the century. I show you this image. It's from a ladies' journal. And I show you this to show you the kind of stereotypical image of the American woman in the later part of the 19th century. She was, of course, white. She was domestic, focused almost entirely on her husband, children, and family. You can't see it from this image, but she was pious, religious, and very much focused on her home. Here she is living inside of her home. Now, who was responsible? Next image. It's this organization, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and its leader, who was responsible for expanding the base of the women's suffrage movement. Now, next image. The Women's Christian Temperance Union lingers on in American history as a kind of ridiculous organization of women who went around breaking up saloons and denying these men who are actually quite tiny in comparison to this big buxom woman, denying them the right for their pitiful little vices, drinking a couple bottles of beer before they had to go home to the old ball and chain. In fact, next image, the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was the largest and most influential women's organization by the late 19th century. Now, next image. The WCTU, next image, Scott. The WCTU, oh, I think we're skipping an image. Well, I'll talk to you here. The WCTU had begun its work by fighting against the abuse of alcohol. And the argument here was that men were the ones who drank too much. They used up their entire wage packets, and then they came home and were violent to their women and children. So this made the issue of intemperance a kind of a feminist issue, but a limited one. Next image. The person who, and I think we are skipping an image. The next one. Okay, go back about 3 images. I think I'm missing one. That's it. No, the one there with the woman. Next one. Here. The person, no, one before that. Yeah. The person who changed the WCTU was its second president, a woman named Frances Willard. This is her on the left and also on the right. This is my favorite picture of her. It comes from a little book she wrote called How I Learned to Ride the Bicycle. The bicycle was the first way that American women had any freedom of movement. And Frances Willard recognized this. And here, a small middle-aged woman, a little bit timid about riding a two-wheeler, nonetheless learned how to ride a bike and put this into a little magazine. And it says a little book, and it says something about her implicit feminism. Next image. Now, how did she deal with suffrage? She dealt with suffrage not in the way that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had dealt with suffrage, who they had argued that that it was a matter of justice for women to have the same rights as men, that women were equal to men, that, for instance, women didn't want to have to pay taxes without being able to vote. And all of those issues were either irrelevant or abstract to American women of the sort of conventional form that I'm talking about. Instead, Frances Willard argued that women needed the right to vote. They needed to be able to step outside of their domestic sphere in order to protect what was inside of it. She retitled the women's suffrage movement, and the term already had sort of a negative association, if you remember that image of Susan B. Anthony. She retitled women's suffrage as the home protection ballot. Women needed the right to vote to protect their homes. I think we'll go to the next image. This cartoon shows that here women are shown being fenced in by trivial pursuits, gossip and fashion, and looking over the fence past women's sphere to the larger world. The argument here was that women needed to vote not because they were the same as men, but because they had different concerns than men. They needed the right to vote precisely because they were different from men. Next image. Here is a very nice cartoon, also from the early 20th century, adapting the idea of woman as housekeeper to the concerns of public life. Here is a very attractive looking woman. We can see we're already in the 20th century because her skirt's a little short. But she's digging up the muck of politics, the dirty pool of politics, to deal with things like white slavery, which we would call trafficking in women. Another issue, which I don't think is shown here, is that, let me get over here. Food adulteration on the left. One of the big issues that brought women into the suffrage movement is to try to do things to make milk safer. Milk was adulterated, and so they wanted laws that would ensure that milk was ensured to be clean. Next image. Frances Willard died quite young in the late 1890s, but this new approach to women's suffrage, which was that women needed to vote for things that were of particular importance to them because of their domestic lives, their maternal roles, etc. This was adapted, was kept into the 20th century. So these are images of two issues that were important to 20th century women that led them into the suffrage movement. But now we're talking about a very different kind of woman. We're no longer talking about that woman who lives in a small town, sort of inside of her home with her husband and children, a Protestant woman. Now we're talking about 20th century American women. They're much less likely to be native born, but now they're immigrants. They're much less likely to be Protestant. Now they're Catholics and Jews. They're much less likely to be wholly domestic. Now many of them work outside the home. So these two images, which are from very famous early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century American photographers, show on the left the image that we might call the question of urban conditions for children. So here we have children. This is New York City, as you can tell by the long avenue. And they are playing on the street because they don't have any playgrounds or any place to play. They're playing on the street next to a dead horse. So women needed their votes to change the conditions of urban life to make that safe for their children. And then on the right, we see an image which we could all either call an image of women workers, or probably more likely an image of girls working, young girls, teenage girls. And the question of child labor was an immensely important question to American women, and helped to bring them into the women's suffrage movement so that they could use their votes to change the laws to make them prohibit child labor. Okay, next image. Now we have the third surprise. Women had the right to vote before the ratification. Many American women had the right to vote before the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Now, as I told you, the constitutional door had slammed shut between the 15th and the 16th Amendments. But also, as I tried to tell you, because of the failure of the women's suffrage amendment that never was, the Constitution continued to limit the right to vote, to give it to the control of the states. And therefore, in these years, before the revival of the amendment, the efforts to win a constitutional amendment, the suffrage movement began to focus on getting women the right to vote at the state level by amending state constitutions. This picture shows you women voting in Wyoming, which became a state in 1890 and brought with it women as voters. So it became the first state to allow women to vote. Next picture. The next picture is of the first state where male voters had to vote on whether to amend their state constitution and give women the right to vote. The year is 1893. The state is Colorado. And these women who are now voting, and they are able to vote, not just in state elections, but they're able to vote in federal elections. These women, as you can see, are immensely proud to be able to be voters. They've got on the biggest hats that they can find, and they are walking with their hands on their hips into their polling place. Now, the women of Colorado and then several other states after them, as I said, could vote for president. The women of Colorado voted for president in 6 elections before the 19th Amendment was passed. So I want you to skip, I think, the next one. Yes, skip that. And now we will come to my home state, California, which in 1911 became the 6th of these states to amend its constitution and give women full voting rights, all the way up to President of the United States. I'm just going to say a few words about this campaign in 1911 to get women the right to vote in California. This was the first, in many ways, it's 1911, the first modern campaign for women's suffrage. Next image. Now the suffrage movement is run by different groups of women. It's staffed by different groups of women. It's staffed by women college graduates. Now, there are not a whole lot of college graduates in the United States, but a lot of them, probably more than half, or at least half, were women. And most of these had graduated from state universities. So that's the women on the left. And then the women on the right are a growing number of wage earning women. Women were something like 1/4 of the labor force by the early 20th century. Next image. The California movement was also racially diverse. On the left is a picture of a woman named Maria de Lopez, who was Spanish speaking. Her family had come from Mexico to California, even before California had become a state. She's a very interesting woman. She ends up working at my university while it was still a teacher's college. And she was highly educated, and she works to spread the right to vote to Spanish-speaking voters in California. The woman in the middle, Clara Chanley, is, of course, as you can see, also an owner of an enormously large hat. And she was Chinese American. Now, for a variety of reasons, there were very few naturalized Chinese citizens and almost no native-born Chinese American women. There were very few. So Clara Chanley is one of the few of those women, but she's being shown here. And this is an effort to encourage the relatively small but important sector of voting population of Chinese American men to support the California suffrage amendment. And finally, Hetty Blonde Tillman is African American, and she worked out of, I think, San Jose, and helped to organize the African American suffrage, African American female population. Next image. By this time, by 1911, we're in a much more modern period, and suffragists are using every technological device they can think of. They're driving their cars to small towns, as you can see here on the left, tooting a horn to bring voters to the town square to vote for women's suffrage on October 10th. There are movies, what are called Nickelodeon movies, showing women's suffrage as something that men should support. There were also women's suffrage. There were also Nickelodeons that made fun of women's suffrage. So these are the technological devices. And then finally, one last image. Next image, Scott. Yes, thank you. This is the poster that represented the California suffrage campaign of 1911. You can tell the years because there's not yet a bridge over the Golden Gate. It's just a break in the mountains out to the Pacific Ocean. But you can see this woman. She has short hair. She's wearing a very fashionable Art Nouveau gown, and she's carrying a sign arguing for, and now we have another name for women's suffrage. It's not called women's suffrage anymore, a very old-fashioned name. Now it's called Votes for Women. This was an effort of California suffragists to break out, if you can bring that old image of Susan B. Anthony back up, to break out that image of women's suffrage as old-fashioned, asexual. It's all right, not necessary. Asexual, unattractive, and instead we have a pretty glamorous modern image of suffragists. Now, the problem with going for votes for women state by state is, first of all, it takes an incredible amount of work. And next image, the real problem is there is no way that many states, especially east of the Mississippi, and especially the former Confederate states, are ever going to amend their constitutions. They are dead set against letting Black women gain the right to vote. So this is the second cartoon. I showed you one that was sort of criticizing white women for keeping Black women out of the suffrage movement. This is a cartoon which is criticizing Black women for wanting the right to vote, votes for colored ladies, and terrifying white women away from the campaign. So you see here yet again another picture of women, as these Black women are again sort of half dressed in men's clothing, their hats, their shoes, and of course their highly stereotypical faces with giant lips. Okay, let's see, next image. I think we're going to stay out of that one. Okay, next one. This image, this is 1914. Next one, please. Not that one, yeah. This map, which shows those states which give women the right to vote, full voting rights, again for president, up to about 1914. And that's really 4 million voters. That's a lot of voters. Now you can see all these states are west of the Mississippi. And so at this point, for a variety of reasons, the suffrage movement begins to go back to attempting to get a constitutional amendment to the United States Constitution. And so this brings us back to the United States Constitution and brings us to the 19th Amendment. Before I sort of open up the last surprise, I just want to say a few words about this image. The federal campaign to amend the US Constitution begins in 1913, really literally when Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated, only the second Democratic president since the end of the Civil War. Now, suffragists have organized an incredibly elaborate parade. Again, now, if you look carefully, you can see this is Washington, D.C., because there's the Capitol in the back. But they're doing this the night before Wilson is inaugurated. Inaugurations took place in March at this point. And this large crowd of men in town, probably Democratic voters, in town for the inauguration, probably a little better for wear, a little liquored up. They are swamping the women's parade and really making conditions really dangerous for the suffragists. Let's see, I think the next image. Next image. Yeah. So at this point, we're in about 1914 to 1916. Suffragists figure out that maybe they can get these women in all of these Western states who have the right to vote to use their votes to pressure the federal government, and particularly the President of the United States, to support women's suffrage. This is a billboard when Woodrow Wilson is running for the second time in 1916. That would have worked, except for one problem. Wilson is running on an issue that's much more compelling to women and suffrage and men as well, and this is the Great War, the World War I, and he is reelected narrowly, and so now suffragists have to figure out something else to do. Next images. And this is a part of the story that I think many of you might know. No longer able to appeal to women voters, they now shift to civil disobedience and begin standing day by day, night by night in front of the White House, petitioning President Wilson and embarrassing him to try to get him to support women's suffrage. Wilson is saying that the United States is going to go to war to protect democracy, and they say, how can he protect democracy if women can't vote? Of course, the United States enters the World War in 1917. Next image. By 1918, next one. By 1918, Wilson has given in and supports the right to vote. Now we move to the last of the surprises. I'm sorry I've been so slow, but we'll try to get this done. I call the first one the Women's Suffrage Amendment that never was, that almost was. And this one I call the Women's Suffrage Amendment that almost wasn't. Because here I want to emphasize how touch and go the last 2 years of the congressional passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment were, so that you don't think that it was a sure bet that women would get their rights to vote inside of the Constitution. Okay, next image. In 1918, in January of 1918, the first of the two houses of Congress entertain a bill to start the process of ratification. And they pass it through very quickly. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that the person standing in the well of the House who was actually introducing the bill is a woman. Her name is, I'm I'm going blank, and I will get there in a minute. I am so sorry. One of you will undoubtedly know the answer to this question. She is a Montana, Jeanette Rankin, it came to me. She's from Montana, and Montana was one of those Western states that in which women could vote, and they voted for her, and she became the first woman to be a member of Congress in 1917, 3 years before the constitutional amendment was ratified. Next image. As I said, it gets through the House relatively quickly, and don't forget, it needs to have 2/3 votes of both houses and 3/4 of the states. It's a very high bar. Next image. But it turned out it was going to be much, much, much harder to get the United States Senate to vote to send the amendment out for ratification. And it took more than a year and a half. Next image. This was one of the reasons. When I wrote my book, I paid no attention to the 1918 pandemic. And now I have to talk about it. So here are women in 1918 moving around in their various states wearing masks. And on the right are probably Army nurses doing the same. Nonetheless, suffragists were not held back. They worked hard to defeat two of their opponents, next image, of the in the Senate, and succeeded. And finally, in I think about June of 19, let's see here, next image. In June of 1920, no, June of 1919, the bill goes through the Senate. Now let's look at the next image. Once again, we see a map that looks very similar. Here are eventually the states that ratified the 19th Amendment. It took a long time. It took, I think, something like 15 months to get the amendment ratified. And in the final weeks of the effort to get the amendment ratified, it looked like it was really, again, going to be touch and go. If you look at the white states, and they're white for a reason, these are all the many of the former Confederate states. These are states, these were slave states. And they, as I said before, are not interested in opening the constitutional door to make it easier for women, including Black women, to vote. And then we have two other states, Vermont and Connecticut. In the end, let's jump two ahead. And I'm almost done here. Next one. In the end, it was the border state of Tennessee, your neighbor, who, yeah, we should look at Kentucky here. Yeah. Yeah, Kentucky voted to ratify. It was Tennessee that became the 36th state to enfranchise women. It did so in August of 1920. And next image, this is the hero of the Tennessee ratification. This good-looking fellow was a 24-year-old member, Republican member of the Tennessee legislature. The legend, and it wasn't a legend, has it that his mother, if you look carefully on the left, you will see her letter to him in which she says, don't forget, sort of midway on the right-hand side, don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Thomas Catt with her ratification. And he voted, in fact, for ratification, much to the surprise of many of his legislative colleagues. There was a lot of pressure on him to reverse his vote, and he refused. He held to the vote, and that gave the women of the United States, of the states where women didn't have the right to vote, a very limited time from August to November to register to vote. And They did so, next image. And here is newspaper coverage from August 26, 1920, women gaining ratification. Next image. Here are women registering for vote, vote and voting in November of 1920. So that ends my story for now. I think I have a tiny little bit of time. I'm so sorry for my screw up. And I'm going to ask my friends here at Louisville to tell me what questions I've got to answer.
Well, thank you so much for that really deep and long look at the coming of the amendment. I know we really appreciated that, and we've had some great questions. Wanted to go back to some of the very earliest parts of your lecture, where there seemed to be, especially before the Civil War, this union between radical abolitionists, those who sought racial equality, and then also gender equality. But that seems to fall apart during Reconstruction. I wonder if you could talk about some of the reasons why that coalition comes apart.
Well, yes, this is an aspect of suffrage history that's gotten lots of attention in this last year as the suffrage centennial and Black Lives Matter have coincided. The union between Black equality and women's rights holds until the 15th Amendment is submitted for ratification in 1869. And at that point, the coalition breaks open. Suffragists split. Some say everyone realizes that the 15th Amendment leaves out women. It prohibits disfranchisement by race, color, and previous condition of servitude. Suffragists had hoped it would include the word sex. It did not. One wing of the suffrage movement says, let us wait, it'll be our turn next. Another wing of the suffrage movement says, this is it. Once the Republican Party can count on Black men's votes, there will be no more political reasons for any constitutional amendments. And I have to say they were right. Now, to that, I would add that there's a lot of anger in the second category of women, those who felt the 15th Amendment had betrayed them, none more so than Elizabeth Stanton. She how shall I put this? She has a kind of underlying elitist, racist, and nativist tendency, which is kept under control for the most part, but which breaks open in this point. And she uses language. She's probably trying to appeal to legislators, and she uses language about racist language that is very disturbing. It's not like she uses the N-word, but she talks about how bad it is for the Constitution to let in, she calls them the sons of bootblacks, and she has other laborers, agricultural workers, and leaves out highly respectable, educated women, the daughters of, as she says, Jefferson and Hamilton. And this leads to a really contentious argument between Stanton and Anthony on one side and Frederick Douglass on the other. It's a very famous episode. I have to say two things about this. First of all, once the 15th Amendment is ratified, that is, for the most part, water under the bridge. And Douglass, Stanton, and Anthony regain their agreements and are friends for the rest of their lives. Second thing I want to say is that it's not quite right to put Stanton and Anthony in the same category, although they're both angry about the 15th Amendment. Anthony is much more an abolitionist in her bones. And all the way for the rest of her career, even when she takes a highly pragmatic attitude towards recruiting white women and leaving Black women out of the suffrage movement, she always, every place she goes, including in places like Atlanta, she goes and she makes sure she visits in Black churches and Black societies. She keeps up her relationships to Black women. And in her hometown of Rochester, in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Black church in Rochester, there is a window, a stained glass window dedicated to Anthony. So I do think, whereas Stanton's attachment to abolition is much thinner than Anthony's. I guess the other thing I would say is that it's a very long movement. Both of these women are dead by the early 20th century. By then, the United States is in a period that we call the Jim Crow period. And there's other generations of women, none of whom come through the abolitionist movement, who have none of the, let us say gracefully, none of the ambivalence that Stanton has, and are just completely uninterested in Black women. And it's interesting that these women, I'm thinking particularly of both Carrie, Chapman, Catt, and Alice Paul, are subjected to a lot less criticism than Stanton and Anthony, for reasons that I'm going to have to solve when I write my biography.
That's really fascinating. And I did want to tie sort of into that in our last question tonight. I really appreciate it. I know we've had some comments in the chat about how you tied the base broadening to these sorts of progressive causes like prohibition and temperance and food adulteration, child labor, et cetera. Did some of the things that we might negatively associate with the progressive era, like social Darwinism or eugenics, did those things have a role in the push for women's suffrage as well?
Well, they're different. Social Darwinism is an intellectual tradition. And I think in the 1880s, and so Stanton is very interested in social Darwinism, not of the more severe character that we think of. Now, when it comes to eugenics, if we want to find the interference of eugenics in the women's rights tradition, we have to go forward a few years to the birth control movement, and that's when eugenics is relevant. It's not particularly relevant to the suffrage movement, which isn't focused on women's bodies in the same kind of way. I'm so sorry. I would love to have more questions. Let me answer one other. Suffragette and suffragist. Can I?
Please.
Yes. The larger word is suffragist. Any woman who supports the right to vote is a suffragist. The term suffragette is developed in England in about 1905 or something like that. And it is meant as a put down. It's meant to trivialize supporters of women's suffrage. But suffragists in England and then in the United States do what other progressive activists do when a word is used against them, a word like queer. Or let's take queer. Queer is a good example. Queer. And then they take the word and they use it and they deprive it by embracing it. Think about the way the word queer is used. By embracing it, they empty it of the kind of power it has to embarrass them. And that's what happens with suffragette.
Absolutely, that's really fantastic. Well, I know as an editor of Filson Publications in the past years, we've been publishing so much on women's suffrage. I have had to be very careful with usage of those two words and query lots of authors about which one do we mean here in this context.
Patrick, you're not the only person who has this problem. It's my first question.
Thanks to all of our audiences, both on Zoom and on Facebook Live tonight. We really do appreciate it. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you very much.